This week, as the 2024 presidential election draws nearer, the possibility of a second Trump term looms larger, and the very question of what is and isn't constitutional becomes increasingly divisive. I want to go all the way back to where it all began. So, in this episode, I want to know, what was the Constitutional Convention? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, returning from the faculty this week is Dr. Emma Long, Associate Professor of American History and Politics and Head of the Department of American Studies at the University of East Anglia. Hello, Emma.
Hi, Liam.
Good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for the invite to be here.
Oh, not a problem. I think by now I don't need to give anyone the whole blurb about your title. I think our listeners are more than used to you being on the show by now.
Very possibly.
But we're also delighted to be joined by someone making their debut on the podcast, a Professor of American History at Edinburgh University. Though originally from Massachusetts, he's been living in the UK now since 1992, teaching all of us on this side of the pond a thing or two about the US. His books include Revolutionary America, 1763 to 1815, and we'll pop a link to that in the show notes for you as well. A big welcome to the show, Frank Cogliano.
Thank you, Liam. Hi, Emma.
Hi, good to see you.
Yeah, great to have you on the show, Frank. I hope I didn't butcher your surname, by the way.
No. This is a long-standing topic of conversation whenever I'm introduced. It was absolutely fine. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. First test passed. So let's jump into this because, the Constitution has been talked about quite a bit in the news, I think more so than maybe it should be. So as people get more familiar with it, that's kind of why we're doing this episode, to really understand, what goes into the Constitution and how it can or can't be amended. So, Emma, I wonder if first you could just clear up some ambiguity for us in the title of this episode. When we talk about the Constitutional Convention, what do we actually mean by that?
Okay, so I think you want to think about it as, I tell my students, as kind of the capital T, Constitutional, capital C, Convention, capital C. It's the only one that's happened in American history. And when we talk about it, it's effectively what we're talking about is the gathering of delegates in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 that we now know, although they didn't at the time. More, I think we'll get on to the details of this in a second because Frank's the expert on this history. But it ultimately is the meeting over a period of months that led to the creation of the US Constitution that we now know and love, or at least we're familiar with if we don't go that far. So that's what we're talking about. There's only been the one at federal level. The Constitution does allow for it, for the possibility when it's talking about the amendment process, so the adding of amendments to the Constitution. It allows for the possibility of a constitutional convention instead of each of the individual states voting on a proposed amendment. It's Article 5, so you often hear it talked about as an Article 5 convention, but they've never happened either. Although there's some suggestion that attempts to do that have been headed off throughout history by Congress taking action. Where you do see constitutional conventions, small c's in this particular case, is at state level. We've talked about the fact that the US is a federal system on the podcast before. Each of the states has its own constitution. Those constitutions are periodically updated and amended. In fact, I saw something that suggested that state constitutions have been either rewritten or significantly amended on average 5 times. And they have an average of about 115 amendments. And if you compare that to the US Constitution, which has never been revised and has 27 amendments in total, you get a sense of there's a lot more going on at state level. So estimates suggest around just under 250 state constitutional conventions over history. The last one was 1986. In Rhode Island. So there hasn't been one in quite a long time. But they do and have happened throughout US history, particularly the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. But when we talk about the Constitutional Convention, we're talking about the one that sees the creation of the US Constitution.
So on that note then, Frank, let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. What was it and how did it come about and why was it needed?
Thanks, Liam, and I think Emma just provided some really excellent context for what I'm about to say, which is to say, the American revolutionaries, the United States declares independence in 1776. They don't win their independence, of course, until the Peace of Paris in 1783. But the act of declaring independence necessitates or sets off a bout of constitution making in the new United States. They're no longer being governed by their old royal charters. In some cases, they simply rewrite the charters, or they don't do very much. But in others, they adopt new constitutions. And one of the things that the Americans thought, at least those who supported independence, was the problem with Britain was it doesn't have a written constitution. It has an unwritten constitution, which is all this parliamentary precedent and common law and so on. And we're going to get this right by having a written constitution, and that'll solve all our problems. And so all the states, or most of the states, embark on this kind of flurry of constitution writing immediately after independence, and as Emma suggests, continuing to the present day. At the national level, there's been much less constitutional experimentation. The United States, the first Constitution of the United States was something called the Articles of Confederation, which was basically, as the name suggests, a series of articles which bound the states together and by which they agreed to cooperate with each other. But most of the action and most of the power in the first years after independence was at the state level. And the Articles of Confederation by the mid-1780s were, in the eyes of some people, not all, and that's important to bear in mind, but in the eyes of some people who wanted reform of the system, inadequate. The chief flaw of the Articles of Confederation, as far as those people who wanted to replace them were concerned, was that Congress acted as a national government. There was no national executive, but crucially, Congress didn't have the authority to tax. So basically, the way taxation was raised was that individual states levied their own taxes and sent what they felt like to Congress. And it wasn't a very good system in terms of trying to run a national government. The national government was very weak. It basically acted as Congress had during the War of Independence. It represented the United States internationally, and it coordinated trade and things like this in terms of international relations, but it didn't have a lot of power. And some people felt, those who were going to support this constitutional convention in the summer of 1787 felt that they needed to create a stronger national government. There was some unrest. There was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. There was unrest in some of the states, and there was a worry that the United States, this experiment in Republican government, might fail. You have to bear in mind, all previous republics had failed, and the framers of the United States Constitution were aware of that. And in their mind, when they get together in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they're acting to save the American Revolution and America's experiment with Republican government. Not everybody agrees with that. The people we're going to call anti-federalists who oppose this say, actually, the system's working just fine. This is unnecessary. So there are differences between and among Americans about whether this is necessary. But those people who support this convention are doing it because they feel that it's necessary to save the revolution. And just one more thing before I finish. It's important to bear in mind, this is a slightly weird meeting in that it's not illegal, but it's extra legal, in the sense that what's important here is these were essentially representatives from a number of the states. There were 55 of them getting together who had, they'd been authorized by Congress to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation, not to replace the Articles of Confederation, which is what they did. And there were lots of, I don't want to overstate this. This has been called a coup by some recent scholars. I think that overstates it because there'd been a long history going back to the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 of Americans getting together. We're talking about men with political power, of course, getting together to have meetings and propose changes. This is how the Continental Congress had started that had dubious legal sanction, but assumed authority, and that authority was recognized. And the Constitutional Convention is of a piece with those previous meetings. So I hope that answers your question, Liam.
Yeah, I was actually really curious as to how it could have taken 11 years from the Declaration of Independence for this meeting to happen, because it felt like a bit of a no-brainer that you can't just act at state level. You need some sort of unifying set of laws. But clearly the Articles of Confederation were that attempt in the early years, and was it just that it was just recognised that they were unfit for purpose?
Yeah, it took 11 years because there are other things going on, notably the War of Independence. And so the American rebels, under the authority of Congress that's declared independence, have waged this war from 1775 to 1783. And they're just coming out of the war, and there's a great deal of post-war economic turmoil, which fuels this desire for reform and for the calling of a constitutional convention. But there are people who believe that the system's working. Remember, they say, look, a loose confederation of states is fine. Massachusetts, my native Massachusetts, has a written constitution, the oldest continuously active written constitution in the world, going back to 1780. It was adopted in 1780. People in Massachusetts think, well, this is just fine. Well, okay, we'll share some powers with the government in Philadelphia or New York, but a loose confederation will work. The way to think about it, and the way I talk to students about this, is you need to think about it. It's a little bit like the evolution of the European Union, there are differences of opinion within the European Union about whether to create a sort of integrated, federalized United States of Europe. There's not a lot of support for that, or to have a looser confederation where some powers are shared and some are not. And I think that in the period from 1776 to 1787, the American states, we use the name United States, and that conjures up what we think of today as the United States, but it was a looser confederation, and there were people who were happy with that, although the cracks were beginning to show certainly by the mid-1780s.
And I think that's something that often gets forgotten when, in contemporary discussions about the Constitution, when it plays a role in politics, in whatever form you think about it. It's that idea that this is the Constitution, it's been in place for all of this time and we should revere it, and the rise of the theory of legal originalism, where we should interpret the Constitution in the way that it was meant by that first generation. It sort of overlooks the fact that there was exactly that disagreement about whether it was necessary, about what it meant, about how things would actually go into effect. And I actually think it makes the Constitution much more interesting to think about it as that sort of the creation over which there is a battle, rather than this idea that somehow these 55 white men at Philadelphia just have the ability to divine these great principles and put them down on paper that generations have to follow afterwards.
Yeah, I agree, Emma. I mean, the belief that this is somehow sacred writ that was handed down by God and is unchangeable and must be unchanged, and we have to divine, I'm using that word deliberately, the original meaning. The men who framed the Constitution and the people who attended the ratifying conventions to approve it didn't agree with that. They knew it was an incomplete document. There's a reason it's amendable. Now, they didn't want it to be amended for what the Declaration of Independence calls light and transient reasons, so that's why it's hard to amend, but they didn't think this was meant to be set in stone forever.
And considering what you've both just said, I mean, it's very clear that actually, I think we've sort of almost lost sight of the fact, looking back at this 250 odd years later, that at the time that the convention happens, the 55 people that went to that had quite separate agendas, because it wasn't that long ago that, these states were just colonies, and I think they considered themselves still quite independent from each other, certainly compared to what we think of the US nowadays. Locking them in a room for weeks on end to sort of thrash out a constitution, therefore, doesn't feel like a terribly productive idea. I don't think it would be very productive nowadays, let alone then. How on earth did it kind of pan out like that?
So imagine for a moment. Well, first of all, I don't know whether either of you have ever been to Philadelphia in the summertime, but it is very hot and humid. And early on, at the very beginning of the meeting the Constitutional Convention sat from And interestingly, the name it was given at the time was the Federal Convention, which tells us something about what its purpose was. It was to create a stronger federal government. But the convention met from May until September of 1787 in Philadelphia, in what we now call Independence Hall, where Congress had met during the War of Independence, where the Declaration of Independence had been adopted and signed, and so on. And they agreed to conduct their deliberations and their meetings in secret. And imagine 55 political leaders. They kept the windows closed for most of the summer so that people couldn't eavesdrop, sitting in Philadelphia in the middle of the summer. These were all great men in their own communities. These are men who are used to getting their way and having power. And nobody talked during the summer. Nobody went on Twitter. Nobody went on social media or the equivalent of the day. Nobody leaked to the press and said, well, this is what's going on, or I'm unhappy, or I'm happy about this. Everybody abided by that, or almost everybody abided by that injunction to keep quiet about what they were doing. People knew it was happening, and people wondered about what was happening, but nobody leaked. It's a very different time than today, that's for sure. I mean, it's unthinkable that would be possible now.
It sounds like a long time, certainly under those circumstances that they were all sort of there, sort of thrashing out the details of this. But when you consider that the US Constitution is still, in play today, it's clearly, to some extent, albeit with several amendments along the way, done its job. That's a relatively short time to be able to achieve creating a whole constitution, right?
I guess. Yes, on one hand, but as Frank just said, they knew it was an incomplete document. Right? These people were leaders in their community. They thought that if it was going to be adopted, they would be the ones in power, so they would be the ones who could work out the gaps and where the ambiguities are, or that at least their friends, colleagues would have the opportunity to do that. So this isn't a kind of we have to cross every T and dot every I and all of it actually has to be absolute clarity. There's a lot in the Constitution that is quite deliberately vague at times, and that's partly because there are compromises everywhere. We'll probably come to that in a second. So on one hand, yes, but on the other hand, when you're trying to create something that's functional, but not necessarily to answer every single question that you think might ever come up in the future, and you think about it in those terms, it's perhaps not as dramatically surprising as you might think it is.
There must have been some things missed for them to need to go back only a year later to draft the Bill of Rights, which was, these are not insignificant amendments to the Constitution. How did things that sort of seemingly important get missed?
The biggest criticism of the Constitution that contemporaries made was the absence of a Bill of Rights. And they were familiar with the concept of bills of rights because some of, particularly going back to the Glorious Revolution, that they were aware of the English, later British Bill of Rights, but also many of the state constitutions, which we alluded to previously, had bills of rights. But they recognized that they had to move relatively quickly to come up with a workable plan. And so it wasn't that they forgot about that. They were aware of the absence of a Bill of Rights. James Madison, who's is really the main architect of the Constitution, although others will make important changes, initially said, it doesn't need a Bill of Rights. We're going to create this system that's going to be so good, and it's going to be so perfect that liberty will be protected, and a Bill of Rights won't be necessary. Now, he was a pragmatic politician and was recognized that people wanted a Bill of Rights. That came up in the ratifying process after the Constitution was proposed and sent to the states, and so compromised on that. But they knew it was incomplete. I think that point that Emma's just made is really important. The other thing I'd say is the premise of your question, Liam, that the United States has had this Constitution since the beginning, and it's worked pretty well. That's true. However, I think that needs to be qualified. We're the United States France, and it counted its republics. I think the United States doesn't have, there's a sort of imagined unbroken line going back to 1787 to the present, which leads to this kind of originalist belief that the Constitution can't be changed. And I just don't think it's true, because I think the Constitution is fundamentally remade right after the Civil War with the Reconstruction Amendments. You could argue that the rise of the state, and particularly the judicial decisions in the 1930s around the New Deal and its aftermath created yet another moment of constitutional change. And then, of course, a generation after that, we have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and so on. So I actually think the United States is actually on its third or fourth republic. We just don't count it that way. And it suits everybody to buy into this belief that there's a kind of, and it's part of the national identity and it binds the country together in important ways. So I'm not dismissing this, but there's a sort of fiction that we have an unbroken constitution from 1787 to the present. In a lot of ways, it's like the British Constitution. It has been amended over time and evolved over time because of judicial decisions, because of amendments, because of different norms and practices. And so the unwritten Constitution has led us, I think, has led to important changes in the written Constitution. It's a slightly complicated and provocative decision.
I think
argument.
There are the words, right? There are the words of the Constitution, right? And then there's constitutional interpretation. And if you think that the history of the Constitution, the words of the Constitution look like it's not really been changed. But if you look at the history of constitutional interpretation, then you see these massive shifts at the points that Frank's just mentioning there, where either because of the Supreme Court or because something happens or because because people begin to shift in thinking or they're moved by legal scholars or whatever, people start to think about the ideas inherent in the Constitution in different ways, and those are really important. It's sort of where we get to now. But I think just going back to the point that you asked about the Constitution, I think the other thing probably worth bearing in mind about why they don't have a Bill of Rights and other things is there's actually fundamental disagreement about sort of power and what power the Constitution is giving to the government. So there's a group of people there who think, well, this is a government of limited powers. We're going to set out in each of the articles what powers they have, and the federal government is only going to have those powers and everything else is going to remain with the states. So we don't need a Bill of Rights because the Bill of Rights will start touching on things that we haven't given them power to deal with, and it risks opening the door to saying, well, we told you could only do these things, but then told you can't do these others with the Bill of Rights, and that's ambiguity. But I think once they get to the ratification process, once they announce what they've done and it starts going state by state and they start getting feedback from states and from colleagues elsewhere, they realize that actually there's this sense in the country as it is that there is a wish for a Bill of Rights, particularly some of the key ones that ultimately become the first 10 amendments. And Madison and others, as Frank said, they're pragmatic politicians as opposed to idealists. They realize that this is probably going to be one of the concessions they're going to have to make to actually get the Constitution in place. So there's part of a kind of deal making going on here as well, which is, okay, you ratify the Constitution, one of our first orders of business will be to think about the Bill of Rights, and we'll take that on. So there's a fundamental debate about how powerful the federal government is or is not in relation to the states. And thinking about what we were talking about with shifts in constitutional interpretation, that doesn't really get resolved until you get to the Civil War. Right? That's playing out in society and politics and Supreme Court opinions until at least the Civil War. So it's also about different thinking about the role for this and the role of the government.
We've talked about slavery on this podcast in other episodes, and Emma, we've talked a lot about the Constitution and the Supreme Court and all these things. We've never really talked about them together on the podcast before, but the Convention and the Bill of Rights and all of these big milestones in building out the sort of legal framework for the US was done at a time when there was huge ideological division in the US between the North and the South particularly, and slavery was a big part of that. I mean, I'm sort of throwing slavery on the table already, but what were the sort of big kind of contentious issues that I guess created ambiguity and conflict at the convention? Because slavery can't have been the only thing that divided people, right?
No, and to some extent, slavery is a manifestation of a different problem that arises at the convention, which is the dispute between the large and the small states about who's going to have power. As Emma said, this is about how power is going to be allocated in a new political system. And it comes up in the context of slavery because, or slavery comes up in the context of that debate, I should say, because the large states, how do you measure how large a state is? Is it in terms of size or population? And it's actually population. This is why the electoral maps that one sees even today, President Trump loves to show the electoral map that has blue and red, and all, most of the country is red because those maps don't reflect where people actually live. Size, when it comes to the federal government in the United States or this constitutional government, is related to population, which then begs the question, how do you count the population? And slavery comes up in that context. It doesn't come up in the way that many people think. And Emma, I don't know about you, but I constantly find myself hearing students and others say, oh, the U.S. Constitution says that slaves were 3/5 human. That is not true. I am not here to defend the United States Constitution nor the people of the Constitutional Convention when it comes to slavery. However, the debate turned on the question of how do we count enslaved people? And Southern slaveholders wanted enslaved people counted 100% when it came to representation in Congress, because it would have given them more power. Because the dispute is about how many representatives do people get does each state get in Congress, and therefore how much power will they have? Northerners say, not because they're necessarily anti-slavery, this is a political calculation. No, we don't want them counted at all. Then there's a related discussion, which is usually forgotten in all this, about taxation and apportioning taxes. And then the two regions have exact opposite positions, where Southerners say, no, do not count enslaved people at all when it comes to apportioning taxes and our tax burden. And Northerners say, oh, hold on a second, we need to count enslaved people for that. They have to be counted 100%. And so the compromise they reached, which has some precedent in previous political disputes right after the Revolution, is to count the enslaved population for the purposes of representation and taxation as 3/5. So if there are, for every 50 enslaved people in Virginia, for example, they'll count as 30. It's not a great compromise from a kind of human rights perspective. Don't get me wrong, but they didn't say slaves were 3/5 human. That wasn't what they said. This will give them, however, this compromise will give the states with large enslaved populations an advantage in the Electoral College and in Congress for the next 80 years. It's not until 1860, when the northern population is so large, Lincoln's election is evidence that the northern population has grown to the extent that this inbuilt advantage for the slave states, is under threat, that will change. But it's complicated, and I'm sorry to take so much time on this, and it seems esoteric, but it seems to be an important point. This is one of the most important compromises that comes out of the convention. The other is, as you know, there are two houses in the United States has a bicameral government, and the Congress has two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. In order to placate the small states, all the states are represented equally in the Senate. Each state has two senators. And so today, Wyoming, with 500,000 people, has two senators, and California, with nearly 40 million people, has two senators. But population is used to determine the number of representatives in the House of Representatives, and this is meant to balance the interests of the small and the large states. But these questions of question relating to slavery, but also the apportionment of power, are really about the differences between the large and the small states. I don't know, Emma, you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it really well. I think they're big debates, right, that play out over the next decades. They don't really solve them. And I have exactly the same battle with my students, is to say they don't talk about slaves as the enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, because they're not paying that much attention. They're not thinking about enslaved people. They're thinking about the institution of slavery in the context of their own power. So that's how that comes about. But the one thing I always say to my students when we start off by looking at the Constitution is, again, to try and move past and forget this idea that is common to think about now, to think about the Constitution as this sort of perfect document handed down on high with no faults and all the rest of it. it's a compromise. The entire document is a compromise between 55 people who had their own state interests and their own personal interests and their own issues about power and representation. They were pragmatists. They knew they weren't going to get everything they wanted, but they needed to create something that would be workable. So when you go through the Constitution, it is one compromise after another. And quite frankly, that's much more interesting. It's much more historically relevant, but it's actually much more interesting than to put this system up on a pedestal and say, well, that's the perfect system and everybody should follow it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the closest analog is, I think, a faculty meeting, a department meeting, when one is discussing and debating what the new curriculum might look like. And not everybody gets what they want.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
I mean, I'll leave that one for now. But,
I appear to have touched a nerve.
But I am keen to sort of try and contextualize sort of the impact of some of these sort of lines of thinking that came into play all the way back then, and how that could still have a really significant impact today. And I'm going to preface this example by saying that this is something I saw on Veep, so I'm hoping it's realistic. But am I right in thinking that if the Electoral College found themselves tied in November between Harris and Trump, that there is a scenario by which the representatives will convene from each state, and one state is one vote, and it literally goes to a state-by-state vote to then pick who the president is. And if that is how it works, and perhaps I'm massively simplifying this, it kind of builds on this very early sort of power struggle by the smaller states that they should all be counted equally as one state. But it does massively skew, in this instance and in this world context that we're in right now today, it massively skews that vote towards the Republicans, right?
Yeah, I mean, given the politics that we're in at the moment, yes. But you also have to remember that when the Constitution was written, the idea of parties, or what gets talked about at the time as factions, were seen as a bad thing. They didn't particularly exist. I mean, areas of interest certainly did, but the idea of political parties where the sort of party interest would dominate over this kind of general idea that you would do things for the good of the country was something that they were thinking less about. And it comes up quite quickly because parties, as we've talked about before, and if anybody who's seen Hamilton will know, parties develop quite quickly, and they might have anticipated that was the case. But that throws a spanner in the works of an awful lot of the way that the US system of government is set up. Not just this, but also in terms of the checks and balances between the House and the Senate and the executive and the legislative branch. But yes, at this moment in time, because Democratic populations tend to be concentrated in bigger cities, to massively generalize. If you look at the electoral map that Frank was just talking about, if you look not just at the state by state, the electoral college one, but there are maps online that you can see that break it down by county within the states, and you can see where the pockets of votes are. And you look at it and wonder how on earth the Republicans aren't just winning every single thing, because in terms of land mass, the blue spots for the Democrats seem quite sparse, but of course that's because the population is concentrated. But Republicans sort of dominate or have at the moment, at least in the House, and they have equal representation in the Senate. But ultimately, if you're going to have an electoral college system, and there's the possibility that you have equal numbers of delegates, because you can't necessarily predict how all of those numbers are going to work out, you've got to have a way of breaking the tie somehow. This is how they decided to do it.
Well, this happened once before. It happened in 1800. In 1800, there was a tie in the Electoral College, and the House of Representatives decided that election. That was the election when Thomas Jefferson ran against John Adams. Adams actually came third in the Electoral College to Aaron Burr, who was meant to be Jefferson's running mate. So they both finished on 73 Electoral College votes, if memory serves. And so the outgoing, and this is one of the ironies of this, the outgoing Federalist-dominated House of Representatives the opposition, the party that had lost the election, had to pick the president between two candidates whom they didn't like. But it took them more than 30 ballots in February of 1801 to settle on Jefferson. So there is precedent for this. However, the kind of issue that you raise in your question, Liam, and that Emma spoke to is very real in the sense that the country was much smaller then. The differential between the largest state and the smallest state in terms of population wasn't nearly as great as it is now. Just the sheer number of states mean many of which have very low populations. There's a real imbalance of the spread of the population, as Emma indicated. Idaho, Montana, the two Dakotas, in that scenario you sketched, will probably vote for Donald Trump under that scenario and would outweigh California, which has an order of magnitude more people than all of those states combined. So if that scenario came to pass, then it's not certain that Donald Trump would be elected, but the Republicans would have an advantage. This reflects the advantage they have in the Electoral College at the moment. The Electoral College over the past 200 plus years has favored one party or another, depending on where we are in the history of American politics. But at the moment, it seems to give disproportionate weight to sparsely populated rural states, which at the moment lean towards the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, so clearly, as we've discussed, there are imperfections, and there probably there's always going to be ambiguity, and certainly as the country itself grows and becomes very different to what it was when the Constitution was formed, there's always going to be needs to challenge that and amend those rules because they take on a different life form. So what will it take for another constitutional convention to happen?
There's a question. Bearing in mind because it's only ever happened once, and that was before the United States was really kind of formed in its sort of modern sense. It's really hard to know what it would take to get there. I mean, there have been calls for constitutional conventions across history, particularly in terms of amendment. I think the largest one was, I think there were 30 states calling at various points for a constitutional convention to pass an amendment on a balanced budget, which wasn't quite the number that was needed. The problem, I think, is, I think there are a number of factors that play into it. One, people have got used to turning to the Supreme Court for answers about the Constitution, and sort of that almost like winner takes all. You either win or you lose in the legal system. So people have got into the habit of going there rather than trying to work through the political arena, which is harder, especially given that politics is so divided at the moment. So why risk it all on a constitutional convention when you can just go to the Supreme Court and take the chance that you might win? I think that's one factor. I think the polarization in American politics makes it exceptionally difficult to see that you'll get an agreement to hold one, let alone what would come out of one, even if you forced them all to give up their phones and told them they couldn't be on Twitter or talk to the press or anything else until they came up with a resolution. So I think I don't know that there's an easy answer to your question, because everything at the moment seems to mitigate against that being able to happen.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Liam, I think what Emma said is absolutely correct. Another issue is the very veneration that Americans have for the Constitution that we've talked about, I think is an obstacle to change. In this, I think the British Constitution is brilliant because we can all pretend it goes back to Magna Carta, but still, add things and make or implement gradual change through precedent. So it works actually quite well. Just the very veneration that many Americans have for the Constitution is an obstacle to changing the Constitution. Also, given the political polarization that Emma referred to, Republicans at the moment seem quite committed to the minoritarian aspects of the Constitution that give them power. We alluded to the Electoral College, the way the Supreme Court works, etc. They don't really have a stake in changing that system because any change would probably eliminate those things. One could imagine a constitutional convention where somebody would propose, hey, let's do away with the electoral college and just go with the popular vote to elect the president of the United States. That seems very modern and sensible, right? Well, if you're the GOP, you've only won the popular vote once since 1988 in 2004. Why would you go along with that? So I think there are kind of practical political considerations, as well as I say, the veneration. Both main parties all invoke the Constitution in different ways, and I think they often think about them in different ways. But that very veneration is actually I think it's a problem. There's a kind of irony here that we here in Britain and Europe think of the United States as a young country, and that's true. But it's got one of the oldest governmental systems of any of the liberal democracies. It's got the oldest governmental systems of all the liberal democracies. It depends on how you date the British Constitution, of course, but it's creaking and not necessarily fit for purpose. But the possibility of change seems pretty remote to me.
There's a really interesting way of looking at and seeing about how that veneration of the Constitution plays out. So the National Constitution Center, that's based in Philadelphia, and is it's a brilliant organization, and they do the most incredible things about raising the profile of the Constitution and how it plays out. But over the last few years, they've had this project to get various people together to sort of do a kind of what if, right? What if we could revise rewrite the Constitution? What if there was another constitutional convention? And they got groups, so they had three groups, sort of a liberal group, a conservative group, and a libertarian group, and effectively said to them, if you had the opportunity to completely rewrite the Constitution, what would you do? What would you come back and create? And actually, if you look at the reports that they came back with, bearing in mind this is an intellectual exercise, right? They could have done what the delegates at Philadelphia did, right, in 1787, and junk the entire thing and start again. None of them did that. All of them start with tweaking, really, the Constitution, sometimes in fairly major ways. But it strikes me as being really interesting that even when you make this a hypothetical exercise, these groups are not starting with, this Constitution is getting in the way of effective government, let's see what we can do from scratch. They start by playing around with it. And all of those reports, they've done things on the Constitution, they've done things on the Bill of Rights and alternative bills of rights and those kinds of things. So if listeners are interested, it's actually a really good project. It's all online. You can see how it's developed over time. But I think it's partly a product of what Frank's talking about, which is Americans are so used to the Constitution being there, they can't imagine anything else being there. And that gets in the way of everything from common sense amendments to thinking about more major changes where the current system isn't working in the demands of a modern world.
Yeah. And on that note, I mean, we'll link listeners to the information that you've just alluded to. We'll put all of that in the show notes for anyone that does want to learn up a bit more about the Constitution, the Convention, and all things related to that. I think this has been a fantastic kind of 101 for people who maybe weren't as clear on how all of this kind of worked. But lots to unpack still, lots to revisit on future episodes. So thank you so much, Emma, of course, and Frank. Hopefully we can get you back on another episode.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And if anyone does want to connect with you both after this podcast, where can they do that, Frank?
I'm at Frank Cogliano on X, although I'm trying to wean myself off X. You can also find me on Instagram and via my University of Edinburgh web faculty page.
Wonderful. And Emma?
Yep, as regular listeners will know, I issue all forms of social media, so they can't find me there. But if you search for me at UEA, you'll find my faculty pages and my contact details there.
Excellent. And yeah, you can find me on X. I'm still there, and on LinkedIn as well. Just search for my name. And if you enjoy this podcast, please do make sure you take just 5 seconds to leave us a rating and a review. It'll just bump us up the algorithms, help other people find us, which will be awesome. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.